17 years. That's how long these trees stood, growing, shading, and silently becoming part of a family's life. They weren't just plants. They were history written in bark and branches. But in one crushing moment, the homeowners association decided those very trees had to go. And not only that, the homeowner would have to pay an eye-watering $21,500 for the privilege of destroying them. This isn't a story about landscaping. It's about control, about how something planted in innocence can turn into a battle of power, money, and survival. When the family first moved into the quiet suburban neighborhood, the backyard was little more than an empty patch of earth. The houses stood in careful, uniform rows, each with lawns trimmed and shrubs pruned, all mirroring one another in a way that felt sterile. The homeowners wanted something different, something alive that could grow alongside their children. So, they planted trees. Not just any trees, but sturdy, fast-growing ones that would stretch tall and wide, casting a cool shadow over summer afternoons. For years, these trees became the backdrop of their lives. Birthdays were celebrated under their branches, swings were tied to their limbs, and autumn afternoons meant piles of fallen leaves that children would run through, laughing until dusk. Neighbors often admired the view. From the street, the property looked lush, full of character, standing out in a neighborhood where sameness was the unspoken rule. The trees gave the house identity, but identity, in places ruled by strict associations, can often be the beginning of conflict. At first, there were no complaints. The HOA bylaws were vague, written in a way that allowed interpretation, but offered little clarity. The trees stood, season after season, their roots sinking deeper, their branches stretching wider. To the family, they weren't just part of the yard, they were part of the home. 17 years passed. The neighborhood changed, board members came and went, rules were updated, but the trees remained. They had grown massive, strong, and undeniably permanent. Yet permanence is rarely tolerated in communities where control is the currency. It started small. A letter tucked into the mailbox. Words written in the tone of authority, not conversational, not friendly, but cold and absolute. The HOA claimed the trees violated updated landscaping rules that restricted unauthorized plantings within certain distances of property lines. What had once been acceptable was suddenly labeled a violation. The family dismissed it at first. How could a fee rule written long after the planting of those trees possibly erase 17 years of growth? Surely this was a mistake. Surely reason would prevail. But as weeks passed, the warnings grew sharper. Fines began to accumulate. What started as small, almost symbolic penalties turned into mounting figures that no one could ignore. Each envelope carried a new demand, a new deadline, a new threat. Neighbors who had once admired the shade now kept their distance. Whispers traveled from yard to yard about rules, about violations, about the dangers of defying the HOA. The family felt a shift. The trees, once a source of pride, were now painted as an act of rebellion. By the time the HOA issued its final demand, the removal of every tree and the payment of tens of thousands in fines and legal fees, it was no longer about landscaping. It was about dominance. The homeowners stood in the yard one last time, staring at the towering giants they had planted nearly 2 decades earlier. To them, each tree carried memories, carved silently into the rings hidden inside the wood. But to the HOA, they were nothing more than violations that needed to be erased, and that's when the battle truly began. The first sign that this was more than a warning came in the form of a certified letter. Heavy envelope, bold lettering. The kind of document that doesn't ask politely, but announces itself like a hammer hitting a nail. Inside was the HOA's verdict. The trees had to be removed within 30 days. Failure to comply would mean escalating daily fines, compounded interest, and legal fees added to the homeowner's debt. The family's disbelief turned into urgency. They pored over the HOA's bylaws, highlighting every section, searching for a loophole, a shred of language that could shield them. What they found was maddening. Rules that had been rewritten over the years, lines that blurred the difference between what was once permitted and what was now outlawed. The HOA leaned on one phrase in particular: unauthorized landscaping. That disrupts uniformity. Uniformity. That word carried the weight of the entire argument. To the board, the trees represented disorder, a break from the perfectly measured lawns and carefully approved hedges. It didn't matter that the trees had been planted before the new rules. It didn't matter that no neighbor had ever formally complained. What mattered was that the board decided these trees no longer belonged. But beneath the surface of the official documents was something else. Money. Every day the trees remained standing meant more fines piling up. What began as a few $100s quickly snowballed into thousands. By the time the family grasped the speed of the avalanche, the total had crossed into 5 digits. The HOA had transformed their backyard into a financial trap. Desperate for help, the family reached out to neighbors. Some sympathized quietly, but kept their distance. Others, fearful of drawing the board's attention, refused to get involved at all. In a community ruled by rules, silence was safer than support. The family felt isolated, cut off by the very people who had once celebrated under the shade of those same trees. Then came the final blow, an official notice from the HOA's attorney. The letter demanded immediate removal of all trees and payment of $21,500 in accumulated fines and restoration costs. It was a number that felt surreal, not a fine, but a punishment. The board wasn't just enforcing rules anymore, it was making an example out of them. The homeowners stood at a crossroads. They could comply, destroy 17 years of growth, and drain their savings. Or they could resist, knowing resistance meant war against a system built to grind down opposition. But what they didn't realize was that the HOA was about to push even harder, and once it did, this fight would shift from a battle over trees to something far deeper, a test of how much power a neighborhood association could wield over the very people it claimed to serve. The day finally came when the dispute left the cul-de-sac and stepped into a courtroom. What had begun as a quiet disagreement over landscaping had grown into a legal showdown, with lawyers, binders full of bylaws, and a judge sitting high above it all, waiting to decide the fate of 17 years of growth. The HOA arrived prepared. Their attorney stood tall, armed with thick stacks of documents, photographs of the property, and carefully highlighted sections of the association's rules. They framed the trees not as living history, but as violations, intrusions on community order. The attorney's voice was steady, precise, and calculated to make the case sound undeniable. The homeowners had broken the rules, and now they owed restitution. For the family, it was surreal. Sitting in the courtroom, they watched strangers reduce their memories to unauthorized landscaping. Every birthday party, every summer afternoon spent in that shade, every neighborly barbecue under the branches was erased, replaced by a sterile argument about property values and uniform appearances. When their turn came, the homeowner's lawyer spoke with conviction. He argued that the trees predated the amended bylaws, that the family had not violated anything at the time of planting, and that the HOA was abusing its power by applying new rules retroactively. He painted the picture of a family being crushed, not because of what they had done wrong, but because the board needed a target to enforce authority. For a moment, it seemed the tide might shift. The judge leaned forward, questioning the HOA about their timeline. Was it fair to penalize homeowners for something that had once been permitted? Was this enforcement about genuine community harmony or about financial punishment? The silence in the room was thick, and even the HOA attorney hesitated before answering. But HOAs know how to play the long game. They introduced new evidence, records of multiple warning letters allegedly ignored, claims that the trees posed risks to underground utilities, and even suggestions that falling branches could endanger pedestrians. Suddenly, the case was no longer about beauty or bylaws. It was about safety, liability, and risk. And in a courtroom, those words carry heavy weight. The judge didn't issue an immediate ruling. Instead, he scheduled further hearings, leaving both sides in limbo. For the family, that limbo was devastating. Every day of waiting meant more legal bills, more stress, more uncertainty. For the HOA, it was leverage. Time itself was a weapon, grinding down resistance with every passing week. Neighbors watched from afar. Some whispered that the family should just give in, cut the trees, pay the fine, move on. Others quietly admired their defiance. But no one stepped forward publicly. The community had fallen silent, unwilling to challenge the system that held them all in check. And so, as the case dragged on, the homeowners found themselves fighting not just for trees, but for something larger. They were battling a structure designed to strip individuality, to erase history, to turn every home into a uniform product. What they didn't yet realize was that this fight was approaching a breaking point, one that would force them to make a decision that would haunt their lives forever. Months of hearings and motions finally culminated in a single sheet of paper that carried the weight of a wrecking ball. The ruling was clear. The family was ordered to pay $21,500 in fines and legal fees, and, perhaps even more devastating, cut down every one of the trees that had stood in their yard for nearly 2 decades. The words stung like betrayal. To the HOA, this was just enforcement, a demonstration that rules had teeth. But to the family, it felt like losing part of their identity. Those trees weren't just greenery. They were woven into the story of their lives. They had been planted with hope, nurtured through storms, and had become silent witnesses to the family's joys and struggles. Now, with the swing of a gavel, they were labeled nuisances, slated for destruction. The cost alone was staggering. $2,150 wasn't pocket change. It was college savings, retirement contributions, and years of sacrifice reduced to a line item on an HOA ledger. The family sat at their kitchen table, staring at the ruling, the numbers blurring together as anger, disbelief, and sorrow mixed into something unbearable. How could their own community, their neighbors, do this to them? Word of the decision spread quickly. Some neighbors shook their heads in sympathy. Others whispered about how the rules are the rules. But beneath it all was a chilling realization. If the HOA could punish 17 years of history, then no one's property was truly safe from retroactive enforcement. It wasn't just about trees anymore. It was about control. The day the contractors arrived was unlike any other. The sound of chainsaws pierced the morning air, echoing through the cul-de-sac like a funeral dirge. Branches that had once stretched proudly toward the sky came crashing down, one by one. Sawdust coated the driveway as the workers moved methodically, dismantling years of growth in a matter of hours. The family watched from inside, powerless. Every cut felt like an attack, every fallen branch like a memory ripped away. The yard, once shaded and vibrant, was left barren, exposed, stripped of character. The silence afterward was almost worse than the noise, a quiet emptiness that made the property feel foreign, no longer their home, but just another house in a row of houses. And yet, the punishment wasn't just financial or physical. It was psychological. The message was clear: resist the HOA and you will be broken. That $21,500 wasn't simply a fine. It was a warning, a precedent meant to keep others from daring to stand up. But what the HOA didn't realize was that sometimes, in trying to crush defiance, they awakened something stronger. For the family, the pain of loss was real, but so was the burning determination not to let this be the end of their story. Because behind that devastation, a question lingered. Could there still be a way to turn this injustice into a fight for something greater? The yard now stood empty. No shade, no whisper of leaves in the wind, just stumps and scars carved into the soil. But for the family, the wounds ran far deeper than the ground outside. The loss of their trees and the staggering $21,500 penalty pushed them to a breaking point. What the HOA had intended as the end of a battle instead ignited a fire. The family began researching, digging through case law, connecting with homeowner advocacy groups, and uncovering stories of others who had been similarly crushed by overreaching HOAs. They realized their story was not isolated. It was part of a larger, unsettling pattern. The breaking point came one night when, sitting at their kitchen table surrounded by paperwork and exhaustion, they looked at each other and made a decision. If the HOA wanted compliance, they had it. The trees were gone, the fine was paid. But compliance did not mean silence. They went public. Their story spread from neighborhood whispers to local news, and from local news to national headlines. Homeowners everywhere heard the tale of 17-year-old trees reduced to mulch because of rules that hadn't even existed when they were planted. Outrage spread like wildfire. Online forums buzzed with support, petitions circulated, and lawmakers took notice, and slowly the tide began to turn. Public scrutiny forced the HOA to confront something they had not expected: shame. While they technically won the case, the community reputation suffered. Real estate listings in the neighborhood suddenly carried a stigma. Buyers hesitated, fearing they too could be subjected to arbitrary enforcement. Property values dipped, and suddenly, the HOA's iron grip didn't feel so invincible anymore. The family, though still scarred financially and emotionally, had found a measure of victory in their exposure of injustice. Their fight sparked conversations about HOA power, fairness, and the balance between order and personal freedom. And though they would never get their 17 years of growth back, they had planted something else in its place: awareness. The final image of their story wasn't the barren yard or the $21,500 check. It was the ripple effect: neighbors questioning, lawmakers discussing, homeowners demanding change. The HOA had broken their trees, but in doing so, they had planted the seeds of a larger resistance. And for the family, that meant one thing: they hadn't lost everything after all.